I've lost all ambition or worldly acclaim. I just wanna be the one you love. I've lost all ambition or worldly acclaim. I just wanna be the one you love. Lost all ambition, worldly acclaim. I just wanna be the one you love. I've lost all ambition or worldly acclaim. I just wanna be the one you love. I've lost all ambition.
Okay, so hopefully video audio is working. Hello to everybody. Good to see you again, even though I can't really see you, but you know what I mean. For this lecture, we're going to be going over Chapter 9, which deals with psychoanalytic approaches to personality. So for this week, we actually have 2 lectures. Both of them deal with the psychoanalytic approach. This one is more classical Freudian material, and Chapter 10 deals more with the neo-Freudian or neo-psychoanalytical approach. So I'll try to keep these lectures relatively brief. I know I always say that, and I always do my best, but because there's 2 of them for you to watch this week, I'll try extra hard. Okay, so we'll get going straight into the material here. And when we talk about the psychoanalytic theory or psychoanalytic approach to psychoanalysis, to personality, we basically have to take a look at essentially what Freud was really proposing, right? And Freud proposed a source of energy that is within each of us, and he used the term psychic energy to describe this type of energy that resides within us that motivates all human activity. So it's this type of psychic energy can account for all of our motivation, can account for all of our activity. And Freud believed that psychic energy operated to the law of conservation of energy. So essentially, the amount of psychic energy that an individual has remained constant throughout his or her lifetime. So it's kind of what we're born with, the psychic energy, and it kind of just stays there, kind of stays constant. So when we see a change in, say, personality, it's a change in personality. If our personality traits change, or our dispositions change, Freud would see this as a redirection of that psychic energy. So not necessarily a reduction, but a redirection. So we're kind of just allotted this amount of psychic energy that will persist with us throughout our lifetime. Changes in personality can be explained by this type of psychic energy being redirected to different areas of our lives. But, an obvious question would be, what is the basic source of this psychic energy? Where does it come from? And Freud believed that there were strong innate forces, so forces that exist within us, that we're born with, that provided all the energy within this psychic system, within this psychic realm. And he called these forces instincts. And the concept of instincts is fairly well known and fairly well accepted, even in humans, right? That we have certain instincts. No problems there, right? So when when it comes to let's say what Freud thought were the two most basic instincts that motivates our behavior. Freud believed that all of our behaviors can kind of be explained by two basic instincts. The first being the self-preservation instinct, and the second being the sex instinct. So self-preservation, hopefully, that's somewhat self-explanatory. That's our will to live, our instinct to stay alive, to not die. And our sex instinct is our instinct to reproduce, to engage in sex. And Freud's theory, particularly his early models, were based very heavily on Darwin's theory of evolution. So Freud was very much influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. And when we take a look at Darwin's theory of evolution, it relies pretty heavily on these two basic, say, instincts, or these two basic criteria in order for an organism to survive and thrive within their environment, is to basically stay alive long enough to pass on your genes, right? So these are strong instincts. I'm sure vast majority of us, not everybody, but vast majority has pretty strong instincts, pretty strong drives to stay alive and to have sex, to reproduce. Sex is clearly not the only reason, or let's say reproduction is not the only reason to have sex, but those instincts are pretty essential to humans in there. So later formulations of Freud's theory collapsed the idea of self-preservation and sexual instincts into one concept or one term that he calls the libido, or the life instinct. So the libido is generally, or was generally, considered to be highly sexual. Freud also used the term libido to refer to anything that was satisfying in terms of satisfying our needs, that gave us pleasure, that sustained life. This was the life instinct, the life part of who we are, or our life drive, let's say. But Freud also believed that we had a death drive. We had a death instinct that he called thanatos, and this could very well be directly related to death and our fear of death. But Freud used this term to kind of refer to any instincts or any drives within us that were harmful or aggressive or destructive in any way. So essentially we have this life drive and we have this death drive that motivates all of our behaviors. So Freud initially believed that this life force, or this life instinct, and this death instinct were opposed to each other. But later on he would argue that they could actually exist in tandem, that you can combine them. So we see here, example, eating most definitely a life drive, right, or part of a life force, a life instinct here, to take in nutrition and calories in order to stay alive. But you could also think, about how we get our food, let's say. Some of it grows on trees, but some of it involves killing animals. If you're an omnivore, right? Or if you're not a vegetarian or a vegan, so we're consuming animals which had to die for that. Even the practice of eating, you can say, has kind of a destructive property associated with it. You're kind of like tearing into food and ripping it apart. There's kind of an aggressive act, biting, right, chewing, that, at least according to Freud, says could be seen as some type of manifestation of this death drive, or this aggression type of drive that exists within us. You might say that's a little bit of a stretch there, but that's why we typically view Freudian theory, at least this early psychoanalytic theory, as more of a historical type of theory, a historical perspective. And Freud still, to this day, is very influential in several areas of psychology, but clearly, over 100 years, psychoanalytic theory has been amended quite a bit. Now, when it comes to, say, again, these basic instincts, because each person possesses a fixed amount of this type of psychic energy, according to Freud, the energy used to direct one type of behavior can't be used to drive another type of behavior. So a person who, say, directs his or her death instinct into, say, a more socially acceptable channel, such as competitive sports or business, right? If you go into business, seen as kind of an aggressive, competitive type of area to go into, this person who kind of channels their aggression drive into some productive areas will have less energy to expend towards more destructive manifestations of this instinct. So Freud would often argue or urge people who had some destructive tendencies to find productive ways to kind of fulfill those destructive tendencies. So instead of beating people up in a bar and robbing them, why don't you go, play rugby, or go play lacrosse, or some other sport where they beat the shit out of each other, right? Something that's more socially acceptable to do. Because Freud reasoned that you only have so much energy to expend on aggression, so you might as well spend it in a productive way. That'll make you less likely to expend it in a destructive way. And maybe you could become a famous rugby player or something along those lines, right? So here we're taking a look at Freud's original drawing that depicts the structure of personality and the different levels of consciousness. So the top layer is perception and consciousness. Then he abbreviates that as PCPTCS, right? So perception and consciousness exist at this top layer. We have this middle layer here, and this involves the preconscious, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the preconscious and this lower level represents the unconscious. So things that we're not aware of, or not easily aware of. So within this unconscious realm, or this unconscious mind, is information that's often, say, unacceptable to have. Either unacceptable by our own standards or unacceptable by society's standards. So these are memories and feelings and thoughts and urges that are really troubling to us, and might be very taboo, very distasteful, that we go to great lengths to not think about these things, because if they were to enter our preconscious or our consciousness, they would likely be very, very upsetting, produce a great deal of anxiety. So many of the cases reported in psychoanalytic literature involve these types of distressing unconscious themes. We'll see this in case studies and a little bit later on, even in this chapter. So these are some things that, that we really shouldn't be thinking about, right? Things that are kind of shameful or socially unacceptable. So things like hatred for your parents, or even hatred for your kids, or sexual desires for family members, or even memories of, very traumatic incidents that happened during childhood, for example. So according to Freud, those things get stuck down here in the unconscious part of the mind, because they're pretty distressing. But they do find their way, let's say, out, in terms of the way that they influence some of our thoughts and our behaviors, or patterns of behaviors. So when it comes to, say, this unconscious motivation, sometimes we don't know why we do what we do, right? Because even though we're keeping all those bad thoughts down into the unconscious part of the brain, they're still making their way out in one way or another. And sometimes that involves us doing things that we're not sure why we're doing those things. So according to Freud, we can divvy up the brain, or divide the brain up into three major parts. The first being the conscious part of our brain, and the conscious part contains thoughts and feelings and images that we're presently aware of. This is kind of what we're thinking about at the moment, right? This is what is on our minds right now. The preconscious contains information that we're not necessarily thinking about right at this moment, but it's information that can easily be retrieved and made conscious. So, well, it's hard to give an example, because they'll say, it's kind of like saying, don't think of a pink elephant, and, well, of course, you're going to start thinking of a pink elephant now, but let's just say 2 seconds ago, I wasn't thinking about my family at all. But if you were to ask me questions about my family, I'd be able to answer them, at least tell you how many siblings I have, what my parents' names are. All that stuff wasn't in my consciousness at the moment, but it was in my pre-consciousness. I'd be able to tell you this stuff. It's information that's readily available, easily retrievable. And the third part of our brain is the unconscious. And according to Freud, this is the largest part of our brain. Most of the information stored in our brain is in the form of these types of unconscious memories, or most of our motivation is unconscious motivation. So this part of the brain holds thoughts and memories that a person is unaware of. And they are not, this is not information that you can easily recall. In fact, Freud would later argue that his process of psychoanalysis was really the only way that you can tap into the unconscious. Now, the unconscious, again, This is not stuff that we're aware of per se, or that we could easily conjure up, but the unconscious does make its way into, it's not our consciousness per se. It certainly influences our motivations and our behaviors. So again, gets to say the title of the slide. Sometimes we do things that we don't know, why we do them. Well, that would be the unconscious at work, the unconscious part of the brain at work. So as we mentioned before, the unconscious includes unacceptable sexual and aggressive urges and thoughts and feelings. So this part of the brain includes all those bad things that we shouldn't think about, that we try hard not to think about sometimes. Okay, so when talking about, say, the unconscious and unconscious motivation, your textbook gives this iceberg metaphor. So essentially, the conscious mind, our conscious thoughts, or even say our subconscious, right? Things that are readily available. These are just the tip of the iceberg of what actually exists within our brains, within our minds. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of explaining our behaviors and our motivations. So many psychological researchers will have, and some still do, agree with Freud that one part of the human mind can contain information about certain things that other parts of the brain are totally unaware of. Freud talks about the unconscious and unconscious memories and unconscious knowledge, but cognitive psychologists, we talk about implicit memories and implicit knowledge. And there's not much of a distinction, right? When we talk about implicit memories, or these are memories we have but we don't know we have. Implicit knowledge, this is knowledge that we have that we don't know we have. Social psychology, implicit bias, these are biases, prejudices that we have that we don't know we have, right? So, Freud, not everything that Freud said was bananas there. Some of it holds up. So I think later on, with chapter 10 or so, we will, talk more about the unconscious, in terms of modern thinking of the unconscious. So we won't get too far into that now, in terms of, the way that we approach the unconscious in contemporary times. But what Freud thought about the unconscious mind is that once something is in the unconscious part of the brain, an urge or desire might later surface in a number of different ways. So it might show up in a reoccurring dream, or a reoccurring nightmare. So if you have dreams or a number of dreams that all kind of deal with the same issue or deal with the same topic, that's something, a therapist who's taking more of a psychoanalytic approach would definitely be interested in exploring, because according to Freud, these desires and these things that are in our unconscious find ways to the surface. They find ways for us to try to uncover what's going on in there. So things like, Freudian slips of the tongue, right? We're all familiar with those. That's when we kind of say something that we didn't intend to say, and might actually be kind of revealing how we really think or how we really feel on an unconscious level. So even things that we experience in terms of physical symptoms, so maybe constant headaches, or hysterical paralysis, so not being able to there's the concept of hysterical blindness, like people will report losing their ability to see after a traumatic event, or out of nowhere. And Freud had argued, well, that's just a manifestation of you not wanting to see the truth about something in your unconscious. And again, not to diss on Freud too much, because we're talking about theories that were developed over 100 years ago, or at least began to be developed over 100 years ago, and we've learned quite a bit. But we definitely know that psychosomatic symptoms exist. Depression and anxiety alone can cause pretty much any symptom imaginable. Name a symptom, depression and anxiety can cause that. So again, Freud might have been onto something here. We'll definitely get to the limitations of Freudian theory and some of the problems with it. But again, when it comes to this iceberg metaphor, what we consciously think and perceive is just the tip. There's a whole structure. There's a whole chunk of ice, a massive chunk of ice underneath the surface that we can't see. And Freud argued that this unconscious material can take on a life of its own. He called this motivated unconsciousness. So essentially, this material in the unconsciousness can leak out into our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. When it comes to psychic determinism, Freud basically was of the opinion that nothing happens by chance, nothing happens by accident. He introduced the idea of quote unquote little accidents of daily life that occur but actually represent something much more important. They're not necessarily accidents. They're unconscious thoughts or desires or motivations that are making their way to the surface that are kind of slipping out, so to speak. So even just calling somebody by the wrong name, or missing an appointment, or breaking something that belongs to somebody else, or being late to class, Freud would say, well, there's a reason for all of those things, right? No such thing as an accident. All of those things happen for a reason, for purpose. Okay. When it comes to determinism in general, this is kind of assuming that the life is all planned out for you. Everything has a reason. There's no such thing as chance. There's no such thing as coincidence. Well, we also study statistics as psychologists, so we know that that's not true. We know that chance does exist, randomness does exist, but there are some things that are kind of obvious. One example that's listed in your textbook, for those of you who don't follow politics, but the first openly gay congressman, he started off as a congressman. I think he became a senator, but Barney Frank from Massachusetts, and they were on the House floor. Texas Republican Congressman Dick Armey, referred to Barney Frank as Barney Fag on the floor of the House. And of course, he didn't intend to do that consciously. He was apologetic and, embarrassed and stuff. But Freud would say, yeah, that's definitely a Freudian slip. Another example that's listed in your textbook is, I actually have been guilty of this too, of, say, a professor who refers to Sigmund Freud as Sigmund Fraud, right? We would say, well, that was, mistake, slip of the tongue. Freud would say, no, yeah, there was actually a reason for why you said that. That was your unconscious slipping out there. So, when it came to, let's take a look in terms of the psychic determinism. Nothing happens by accident. There's a reason for every action, every thought, every feeling that we have, even if we don't know what that reason is. But everything we do and say and think and feel is an expression of our mind, whether it's the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, or the unconscious mind. And the reasons for this can be discovered if we're able to tap into the unconscious. So if we can start examining the unconscious mind, we can start understanding the reasons for why we think and feel and behave in the ways that we do. Freud also believed that most symptoms of mental illness are caused by unconscious motivations. And in order to cure mental illness, you have to uncover those unconscious causes. And that's essentially the goal of psychoanalysis, is to delve deep into the unconscious, and bring it to the conscious level. Take those unconscious feelings and thoughts and urges and examine them and make them known, and make those unconscious feelings feelable. Let you experience them. That's the only way that you can get rid of them, essentially. And Freud came up with the psychoanalytic approach to therapy. He had a friend, Joseph Breuer, in the case of Anna O. So Breuer was a physician who had a patient called Anna O, not her real name. But Anna O was taking care of her father, who had TB. So he was dying. And she started to develop, a severe cough. She also developed some odd symptoms, like not being able to drink fluids, not being able to, drink water, a whole bunch of these symptoms that Breuer couldn't really understand what might have been causing them. So he reached out to Freud, and Freud kind of gave his advice on types of questions you should ask, and type of information that you should try to gather from her. And it was through this case of Anna O that Freud was essentially testing out some of the principles of this theory that he had of the unconscious. So one of the symptoms I also remember is that Anna was experiencing some paralysis in one side of her body. So essentially, Brewer started to just talk to her and ask her questions, ask her a lot of questions about her life and her family and her dad and all this. And through talking about this stuff, her symptoms started to lessen. They started to get less severe, and ultimately, they started to go away. So when it came to the severe cough that she had, it was really talking about her father ultimately died. So it was talking about the grief of losing her dad, that kind of without talking about that grief, without really allowing herself to experience it, it was coming out as a physical symptom. So once she started talking about it, the cough went away. This issue of her not being able to drink fluids during one of their talk sessions, she had mentioned recalling seeing a dog drink from some woman's glass, and it totally revolted her, made her sick to her stomach. And then as soon as that memory came about and she talked about it, she all of a sudden was able to drink water again. She was able to drink fluids again, so on and so forth. So you could read more about Anna O. But this was essentially the beginning of psychoanalysis. Freud wasn't doing it himself. It was her physician who was doing this, but with the advice and consultation of Freud. And Freud was paying close attention to basically see how his theories were working or not working, as this dude Brewer was using them. So he took note, and made revisions as needed, and basically developed the notion of talk therapy. He developed psychoanalytic therapy from this case. Now, psychoanalytic therapy, how Freud approached, say, treating patients, was based very heavily on his theory of the structure of personality. So the psychoanalytic theory of personality, essentially it asks, how is it that the mind can have so many different parts, right? Which is what Freud claims, is that the mind has all these different parts. So how can we have all these parts, and how can they all work together to form this sense of personality? We'll see on the next slide. We'll kind of use an example of say plumbing, which is what your textbook uses to try to explain how these different parts of the mind work together to produce a single personality, to produce a person, essentially, right? But the psychoanalytic theory of personality is concerned with how people cope with their sexual and aggressive instincts, so their life and death instincts, within the constraints of a civilized society. So we can't just go around doing the things that our sex or our life drive and our death drive kind of try to compel us to do. We have to live within the society, and there are consequences for breaking the rules of society, certainly breaking laws of society. So according to this theory, one part of the mind creates these urges. So one part is responsible for these sexual urges and these aggressive urges. Another part of the mind has a sense of what society expects from us, and the third part of the mind tries to satisfy those urges within society's boundaries, essentially. This third part tries to mitigate the other two, tries to reach a compromise between fulfilling those urges while remaining within the bounds of what is quote unquote acceptable behavior. So if the mind is a plumbing system, as we say, we'll use as an example of how these three parts of the brain, or not the brain, but the mind, can work. If the mind is a plumbing system which contains water under pressure, pressure is a metaphor for the energy, the psychic energy that comes from our sexual and aggressive instincts, which builds up and will demand release. Otherwise, it will explode, right? So we have this water that's building up and will eventually need to be released somehow. So there are three schools of plumbing when it comes to internal pressure. In terms of, let's not use plumbing there. There's three parts of the mind that deal with these instinctual urges, that deal with these instincts in terms of how they should be released or how they should be kept under check, right? So they don't explode. One instance here, saying, again, using the plumbing analogy here, one plumber would say, open up all the valves at the slightest pressure. So just open up every valve and just let everything go. Let all the water go. At a slow but steady pace. This part of the brain would be what Freud would term the id. Is kind of do what you want. Act upon those urges. Act upon those basic instincts. Another offers ways to redirect the pressure so that the strain is relieved without making a mess or without flooding your whole house. This is the ego. The ego says, well, let's find a way to let out some of this pressure without causing a disaster or without flooding your house, ruining your house, essentially. And yet another, say, plumber in this analogy that your book uses wants to keep all the valves closed. No, just keep them closed. We're not going to explode. Don't worry about it, right? We just need to keep them shut. And we can think of this as the superego. None of those urges, none of those instincts should be allowed to manifest. None of them should be released or come to the surface. So when it comes to the id, this is the most primitive part of the mind. According to Freud, it's something that we're born with. These are instincts. This is where our sex drive or our sex instinct, and again, when we talk about the libido, Freud later amended the libido to not just include sexual pleasure, but all type of pleasure. This is the feel good part of the brain, the life force. Enjoy life. Enjoy that ice cream. Have sex. Enjoy all the pleasures that life has to offer. Why not? Right? That's the part of the id. That's the life force, the libido. He also said that we have a death force, a destructive force, in there as well. So both of those forces, these two major instincts, lie within the id, something we're born with. We could think of them as instincts. And the id is the source of all of our drives, all of our urges, all of our motivations. So the id operates according to what Freud called the pleasure principle, which is the desire for immediate gratification. So we want it now. So do it now, right? Don't wait. Don't plan. Don't just do it. You want food? Go. There's a guy eating a slice of pizza. Just go get it. Go take it from him and eat it, right? The pleasure principle demands instant gratification. So, according to Freud, the id, this part of our mind, can't tolerate any type of delay in terms of satisfying its urges. So when we're infants, when we're babies, it's pretty much all id, right? Take a look at an infant. When they want something, they want it now, and they will make it known that they want it now. Even when that could mean food, that could mean a diaper change, that could mean attention. But even if an infant sees a toy that they want, they're gonna reach for it. They're gonna fuss about it until they can get it. So when we talk about infants, they're operating almost exclusively on id, basic instinct there. Also, it functions according to primary process thinking, which is thinking without logical rules or conscious thought, or an anchor in reality. So, what Freud meant by primary process thinking is that, say that we can have these types of thoughts that might seem irrational, but they're reflective of the pleasure principle. They reflect what we want, or what we desire. And we can think of say as adults that we can relate to things like dreams and fantasies. Might be an example of primary process thinking. So a lot of our dreams are not really rooted in reality, or they definitely have. They don't necessarily follow the normal rules of reality. You can fly in your dream. Contrary to popular belief, you can die in your dreams and not die in real life, right? So we could walk through walls. We can do a whole bunch of stuff in our dreams that we can't do in real life. So this seems to be kind of pretty illogical. It's not following any type of logical pattern here. But Freud would say, but there's still a thought process happening there. There's still some principles within those illogical thoughts, within those dreams, or even, say, some fantasies that, we're old enough to know that would be unlikely to happen. Freud would say there's still some useful information going on there, in those irrational thoughts, and in those fantasies, and in those dreams, and they are usually associated with the idea of wish fulfillment. That these types of thoughts and dreams represent something that we want to happen, something that we want to experience. So when we talk about wish fulfillment. This is something unavailable that is conjured up, and the image of it is temporarily satisfying. So what do we mean? Well, if an urge from the id requires some type of external object or even a person, right? If there's some urge that we have that involves something or someone that we can't have, the id might create, say, images in the forms of fantasies or in the form of dreams that can temporarily satisfy that urge. Dreams and fantasies are not likely to be enough ultimately. The id will find other ways to try to fulfill this wish or to satisfy this urge. But sometimes it can come out in terms of daydreams or even delusions, meaning thoughts that we believe to be true that are not true at all. Delusions may very well, according to Freud, may very well be a form of wish fulfillment there. Okay, the second part of the brain that we mentioned is the ego. This is the executive of our personality. This is the part of the mind that tries to keep the id under control, keep it grounded in reality. And the ego develops within the first 2 or 3 years of our lives, and it operates according to the reality principle. So according to the reality principle, the ego understands that actions that satisfy the id, right? The id wants to do a whole bunch of stuff that can lead to some problems in real life if we were to act upon it. If we were to act upon every desire, every urge of the id, we would probably be in a lot of trouble. So the ego understands this, and it tries to redirect some of the urges that the id has. It tries to, let's say, postpone some of the urges that the id has, or just try to avoid acting upon some of the urges that the id has. So the ego is there essentially to try to keep the id grounded in reality. Let's say, let's find a way for you to satisfy those urges, id, that I know that you're having. This urge here to like punch someone in the face, but that'll probably end up with you in jail. So why don't you just say something mean to them instead, right? So that way you can get satisfied, and we can stay out of jail. So the ego is there as kind of like a mediator, kind of like a check on the id. Make sure that we don't do anything too crazy. And the ego will often operate under the premise or under the process of secondary process thinking, which is the development of strategies for solving problems and obtaining satisfaction. So it's kind of the ego's job to keep the id under control, and that could involve some creative thinking on the ego's part. So this type of secondary process thinking often involves taking into account the restraints that reality puts on the id involve saying, no, id, we can't do that. That's going to end up, being really bad for us. So when the id is about to say express an urge, the ego will kick in. Hopefully, right? If all goes well, the ego will kick in and try to satisfy the id's urge in a more socially accepted way. There are some urges of the id that there really is no way to satisfy in a socially acceptable manner. So the ego will try to suppress those urges coming from the id. And then we have the superego, the third part of the mind here. So the superego is the upholder of societal values and ideals. So Freud emphasized the role of the parents, the way that we were raised as he emphasized the parental style, our parents, as kind of being the most important part of the superego, being the most important part of how our superego develops. So if we're instilled with good, say, values from our parents, the superego will operate upon those values, but also societal values in general, the values that we get from our peers, that we would get from our teachers in school. One would argue now that we get or experience from the media, so on and so forth. So the superego is, what many of us would refer to as our conscious. This is the, if we see those cartoons or memes of like, an angel sitting on one side of our shoulder and the devil sitting on the other's shoulder. One of us is telling us to do the right thing. The other one is telling us to do the wrong thing. We could think of the id as kind of the devil, the demon over there saying, just do whatever you want. It's okay. It's all good. We could think of like that angel or, that heavenly body or creature or whatever, as the superego, right? This is our conscience telling you what is right and what is wrong. So the conscience or the superego seems to begin to develop around age 5. So it's pretty young. If any of you have any toddlers in your family, or wasn't too long ago, since you were age 5. I mean, I don't remember any of it, but some of you might. It's a very young age, right? A very young age for a child to start to develop these type of societal values, or let's say morality, in that sense. So the main tool of the superego is enforcing right and wrong, or rather, the main tool in enforcing right and wrong is guilt. This is where guilt and shame comes from. So again, our conscience telling us that we should not do this thing, right? So if we have a particular urge that's coming from the id, the superego is going to say, hell no, we're not doing that, right? Because we're not going to feel good about ourselves. If we do that, it's the ego's job to make a compromise between the id and the superego. So, like the id, the superego is not bound by reality. We might have very unrealistic standards for ourselves. We might have very unrealistic, let's say, morals or very unrealistic codes of behaviors. Just as an example, during the early 2000s, under the Bush administration, the only type of sexual education that the federal government would fund was abstinence only. So the only type of sex education that the federal government would pay for was no sex education, basically saying don't have sex. That was it. Okay, so that's a very superego type of thing for the government to kind of push. Okay, that could be a good standard, like don't have sex before marriage. I don't necessarily see any benefit in that. I mean, of course, there could be some benefits in that, but is that really realistic? I mean, you're going up against the id during puberty, right? So not just the part of the brain that's saying, yeah, we need to get laid. You also have all of these hormones throughout your entire body saying, yeah, we need to get laid. And the superego is saying, no sex before marriage. That's sinful. Okay, well, you got a problem there, right? You got the id might be acting a little irrationally. Maybe you shouldn't be going out and boning everybody who comes in sight. Especially, puberty, tend to go through some awkward stages there. You might not even be getting laid as much as you think you might be getting laid. So your distortion of reality might be pretty messed up. And then your superego now, who just got all this abstinence education, yeah, that's probably not realistic either. No sex until marriage. Hey, God bless you. No pun intended there. Because abstinence education is usually rooted in religious beliefs. But yeah, God bless you if you're able to maintain that. But that's a pretty unrealistic standard there. So the superego could be, pretty unreasonable as well. So that's where the ego usually kicks in and says, okay, well, let's try to satisfy the id. The id wants to have sex, and the superego says, hell no, we ain't having sex. But let's do oral instead, right? That doesn't count. So we'll find other ways to kind of satisfy the id while maintaining the superego. The ego is the compromiser. My birthday is coming up at the end of the month, the 30th. So I just made it to a Libra. So I'm like, the ego is a Libra, definitely a Libra, right? It's the great compromise. That's how I always think of the ego, even though I don't believe in astrology or any of that stuff. It's just funny to think of that. It's like, okay, id, I get where you're coming from. Okay, superego, I get where you're coming from. Let's see what we can do to make everyone happy here, right? We still got hand jobs, still got blow jobs. Does anal count? I don't know. Did they mention anal in abstinence only education? I don't know. Superego might have a problem with that, but the ego's there to kind of balance it out. So what happens though when you can't come up with an agreement here? You got three parts of the mind that are constantly negotiating, or they're in constant interaction, but they're also constantly negotiating. The ego is always trying to get the superego and the id to agree on, a course of action that's not going to make you feel like a complete, trash person, a piece of garbage there. So when it comes to, how these three parts of the mind work, it's not always going to be pleasant. In fact, it could cause quite a bit of anxiety. So when we see that, some parts of the brain are wanting one thing, and other parts of, I keep saying brain, we're talking about the mind, not the actual gooey physical structure of the brain. But some parts of the mind are going to want one thing, and some are going to want another. This can produce anxiety, and we define anxiety as an unpleasant state that signals that things are not right. These three parts of the brain are having some difficulty working together, and we need to do something about it. We need to stop this, right? We think of anxiety as physical pain. We experience physical pain as a warning to our brain. It's like, hey, look, dude, your toe is like really hurting bad, so hopefully you're going to be paying attention to that pain, and you could try to make sure that that toe doesn't have to get amputated, right? Pain is a signal to your body that something is wrong, and so is anxiety. And Freud identified this pretty early on, right? So anxiety signals that the control of the ego is being threatened by reality, by either impulses from the id, or by harsh controls exerted, or harsh standards exerted by the superego. So essentially, anxiety is a sign that your mediator, your Libra part of your brain in there, that ego, is having a hard time getting the id and the superego to come to some agreement here. And according to Freud, there's three different types of anxiety. The first is objective anxiety, which essentially is fear. And objective anxiety is in response to a real external threat to a person. So it's legit. This is when we're legitimately being threatened. It's a real threat. Neurotic anxiety occurs when there's a direct conflict between the id and the ego. So the id and the ego are having some problems there. When we talk about neurotic anxiety, it's usually irrational. So it could be an irrational thought that's causing you to feel anxious, or it could even be free floating. It would typically be free floating according to Freud, this type of anxiety that you don't know the cause of, right? Something that today we would call generalized anxiety. We also have moral anxiety, which Freud said is caused by a conflict between the ego and the superego. So moral anxiety often will result in shame or embarrassment, right? So this is the type of anxiety where we're worried about what we think of ourselves, or what other people might think of us. Regardless, in all three types of anxiety, the function of the ego is to cope with the threats and defend against dangers in order to reduce the anxiety. So your ego is pulling a lot of weight in this psychoanalytic theory of personality. it's really the ego that is trying to balance all this shit out. You kind of have two really irrational people: the id, the superego, and the ego, who's just trying to make you a normal, quote unquote normal, and quote unquote healthy human being. But because it's unpleasant anxiety, because it's unpleasant, people try to resolve the conditions that are causing the anxiety. These efforts to protect ourselves from anxiety are what's known as defense mechanisms. So sometimes we just go out of our way to avoid anxiety, and you know, when it's successful, or when everything's going great, we're able to get the id, super ego, and the ego to work things out and resolve it, and the anxiety will go away. But a lot of the times we can't, because we don't have the tools to be able to do it. There's a bunch of stuff in that unconsciousness that we're not dealing with, that the id, the ego, and the superego are still clashing. Well, we have a whole bunch of other tools at our disposal to get rid of this anxiety, and those are called defense mechanisms. So the defense mechanisms serve two functions. The first is to protect the ego, and the second is to minimize anxiety and stress. And there's a whole bunch of different defense mechanisms. These are the more common, more popular ones, more talked about and more studied. The first is repression, and repression refers to the process of preventing unacceptable thoughts and feelings or urges from reaching conscious awareness. So we basically shove those things back down, deep down into the unconscious. The second is denial. This is different than repression. Repression, we're shoving everything into the unconscious. Denial, it's still, these thoughts are still in our consciousness, except that now we are insisting that they're really not what they seem. It's a form of rationalization. We could think of it that way. We'll see in a moment, but we're not denying that something happened per se, but we might be denying that the reasons for why it happened. So it isn't really that, right? So, you know, somebody gets shot, as they're running away, someone shoots them in the back. You might say, well, no, they posed a threat, or it's not what it seems, right? You're really kind of denying the facts of the case, or you know, that's not what happened. That didn't happen. Or another example, let's say just in terms of like climate change or something. You know, the humans aren't responsible for it. The climate always changes, right? It's like, okay, yeah, just, you know, you're denying a whole area, a whole field of science there. But you do you, I do me. Displacement. So, when this is what happens when a threatening or unacceptable impulse is channeled or redirected to a non-threatening target. So displacement, let's just say an example might be that you really, really hate your boss at your job, and you would love nothing more than to you know, scream at them, yell at them, take out all of your anger that you have towards them. But they're in a powerful position. They can fire you. So instead, you'll turn that anger and that aggression on, say, your significant other when you come home from work, or on your kids when you come home from work. You're basically taking your feelings towards that threatening object and displacing them, putting them on to something else that is non-threatening, or say a non-threatening type of target. Rationalization. So rationalization involves generating acceptable reasons for outcomes that might be otherwise socially unacceptable. So essentially, this is making excuses for our behaviors. So in rationalization, the goal is to reduce anxiety by coming up with an explanation for an event or an outcome or a behavior that is easier for us to accept than the real reason, right? So if let's say you're in an abusive relationship, you might rationalize the abuse by saying that, well, the person who is abusing you is just having a very difficult time at work. It's just a very stressful time at work. Well, that's an excuse. That's a rationalization that is easier to accept than this person you chose to spend your life with, or a significant part of your life with, is an abusive person, right? So we tend to rationalize or minimize things that are within or beyond our control, because the reality is too difficult for us to deal with. Reaction formation. So reaction formation involves suppressing the expression of an unacceptable urge by continually displaying behaviors that indicate the opposite impulse. So a good example of this, and projection, that we'll see in a minute here, is when people who have extreme moral indignation about things that are none of their business, I'm always very skeptical of those people, right? So people who are so opposed to, say, homosexuality, so it's a sin and these people are disgusting and it should be unlawful and they shouldn't be allowed to teach and stuff. You're like, okay, this affects you how, right? Because you seem to be really passionate about this stuff. You seem to have a whole lot of opinion about something that doesn't seem to really affect you in any way, unless it does affect you in some way, right? Because it seems like there's that famous Shakespeare quote, right, that comes from Macbeth. I think the lady doth protest too much. Basically, anyone who is going out of their way to say, I really hate gay sex, they probably really like gay sex. Just, that's not even Freudian stuff here. We got actual empirical research to back that up. But somebody who is very anti-drug, let's say, we gotta fight against the legalization of marijuana, and they might show up to anti-drug rallies or volunteer to teach children about the dangers of marijuana or cannabis. And yeah, those people almost definitely are smoking weed at home and probably growing it themselves. Like they're really going out there on a limb, like to the point where it seems like they got something to prove here. They're not fooling me, and they're not fooling you either, right? Because you're psychologists. So we know there's something up there. When it comes to projection, it's sort of like reaction for formation. So when we talk about the defense mechanism of projection, it's based on this notion that sometimes we see others, or we see in others, in other people, traits that we hate about ourselves. So projection is, I mean, all of these could be unconscious, but projection is more about seeing the faults of yourself, seeing them in other people, kind of projecting them on to other people. So if you are a very dishonest type of person, and you cheat on your significant other or romantic partner, you might accuse them or be suspicious of them cheating on you. That would be a form of projection, right? So they might have never given you any reason to distrust them, but you still do distrust them. Why? Well, because you're kind of projecting your own feelings of distrust or your own qualities of distrust onto that other person. And then finally, sublimation. Sublimation is a way to take a destructive urge and turn it into a productive outcome. So let's say if you have these, just let's say, really aggressive types of urges, you just want to beat people up all the time, maybe you'll join kickboxing instead, and not just join kickboxing, but maybe you'll like kick ass, literally and figuratively, in kickboxing. Maybe you'll go on to win tournaments or trophies or something like that. So it's a way of taking, say, this bad impulse, destructive impulse, and turning it into something productive. So, one way of looking at this, something interesting to think about, is most people could never be surgeons, because most people would find it extremely disturbing to cut up human bodies and take out organs and do all that type of stuff. So the people who do become urgens, who knows, maybe those were potential serial killers, but through sublimation, they took those urges of chopping people up and turned it into a very lucrative and much needed career. That would be an example. And of course, I'm trying to make a little bit of a joke there, but not really, right? I mean, some truth involved in that, potentially, at least according to Freud's theories. Okay, so when it comes to the different stages of personality development for Freud, this is where things start getting a little untestable, but also a little odd in some respects. This is kind of where you start losing a lot of modern or contemporary psychologists, including contemporary psychoanalysis. So even people who still are kind of on Team Freud have largely abandoned these psychosexual stages of development, but they're still pretty interesting to talk about, and they're definitely still used to describe people's behaviors, rightly or wrongly, right? So Freud argued that all people will pass through a series of stages in personality development, and this is the psychosexual stage theory, and at each of these first three stages, young children must face and resolve specific conflicts. So each of these, well, when it comes to the first three stages, there are particular conflicts that a child must overcome in order to become a healthy, well-adjusted person. So conflicts will revolve around ways of obtaining sexual gratification for at least these first three stages. Children will seek sexual gratification at each stage by investing libidinal energy in a specific body part. In other words, depending on which stage we're in, we're going to experience sexual gratification through different parts of the body, which we'll get to in a moment here. So if a child fails to resolve a conflict at a particular stage, he or she may get stuck in that stage or become fixated. So if you have heard somebody say, you have an oral fixation or so, they might not really know what that means, but it basically, according to Freud, means that you're kind of still stuck in the oral psychosexual stage of development. So each successive stage will represent a more mature mode of obtaining sexual gratification. So we'll see as we progress through these psychosexual stages, each stage gets closer and closer to, quote unquote, healthy adult sexual gratification, at least in terms of how Freud defined them. We'll also see that the final stage of the psychosexual development results in a mature adult that's able to have healthy sexual and romantic relationships with people, and to have healthy relationships in general, even non-sexual or non-romantic relationships. So the first stage is the oral stage, which exists from birth to about 18 months. And during this stage, the main source of pleasure and tension reduction are the mouth, the lips, and the tongue. So we see during this stage, children are, we have formula now, but say traditionally or evolutionarily, historically, infants would be breastfeeding. So their source of pleasures, their source of food, their source of life comes from this type of stimulation of the mouth. We also see that, kids during this age basically explore the world around them by putting everything in the mouth, and they have instincts to suck on things. So according to Freud, this is actually satisfying a sexual need or a sexual urge. The key conflict is going to be weaning or withdrawing from the breast or from the bottle, essentially getting the child away from, or the infant at this point, getting them away from constantly wanting to suckle, right? Getting them to move on to solid types of food. And according to Freud, to different forms of sexual gratification. So in this stage, the conflict is both biological and psychological, because there's that biological component. From that standpoint, the id wants the immediate gratification that comes from sucking or suckling on the breast to get the food, to get the nourishment, and the pleasure, the physical pleasure that comes from that, and the stimulation of the mouth. From a psychological perspective, the conflict is one of, let's say, excessive pleasure and dependence. According to Freud, is that there might be a psychological component in terms of detaching, right? Literally and figuratively, detaching from the mother's breast might have a psychological fear of abandonment or isolation associated with it. So sometimes a child might have a painful or traumatic experience during this weaning process that can result in a fixation at this oral stage. And we would see in adults who might be fixated in this type of stage, or getting fixated in this stage might produce certain behaviors later on in adulthood. Say adults who still gain a lot of pleasure from some type of oral stimulation, and typically we associate that with overeating or with smoking, but also things like biting your nails or chewing on pencils, stuff like that. People who subscribe to this type of psychosexual stages of development might say there's probably some type of issue, and this person's stuck or fixated a bit in the oral stage. So also when it comes to certain types of verbal behaviors or aggressive types of behaviors, because when it comes to the oral stage, sucking is definitely part of it, but also kids will start chewing on things and like kind of biting things. So a person who kind of gets fixated in the oral stage might grow up to exhibit hostile types of behaviors. They might be very mocking, very kind of insulting towards other people, or very biting in their language, so to speak. When it comes to the anal stage, this is 18 months to about 3 years. During this period, the child obtains sexual pleasure from first expelling feces, and then during the potty training, the toilet training, they'll gain sexual pleasure from retaining feces. So the anal stage is all about holding things in and letting things go, and the pleasure that comes from that. Also the physical pleasure that comes from defecation, along with the psychological, say, pleasure of letting things go or holding things in. So at first the id desires to just immediately reduce its tension by just crapping anywhere and everywhere at all times. This is what diapers are for. So eventually, a child is going to learn to be able to have some more control over their bowels, and their bodies will develop in such a way that will allow them to have more control over their bowels. So they start to develop a sense of agency and a sense of autonomy, that they can do stuff. They can do something, right? And I mean, they can control an important part of their body in there. So when it comes to, say, the way that the parents approach this new ability, or help develop this type of new ability in the child, whether they're encouraging, if they are say, show a sense of pride, so to speak. In other words, if the toilet training goes well, then the child should grow up to be able should grow up to be able to let go of things, to kind of be, less uptight, so to speak. So some children will achieve too little control and over their bowels, or too little control during this whole process, and they might grow up to be, more, say, sloppy, or more unkept, so to speak. Other children might have the opposite problem. They might develop too much self-control during this process, and they can grow up to be almost compulsive and overly neat and very, very rigid. We call them anal, right? We say this person is really anal, or they have a really anal personality. We're referring to, well, they had some issue during this stage that they're fixated on. But the conflict during this stage revolves around this issue of a child's ability to achieve self-control, and having some problems, not fully overcoming that conflict, can result in some characteristics, personality characteristics, later on in life. The phallic stage, so this is ages 3 to 5 years old, and by this time the child has discovered, if it's a biological male, he's discovered that he has a penis, or if it's biological female, discovered that they don't have a penis. So this, according to Freud, we'll see in a minute here, could cause this is a major turning point, this phallic stage. In fact, just take a look at the next stage, the latency stage. This phallic stage is so important and so traumatic that children will kind of give up sex, kind of go dormant after this stage until the hormones from puberty start kicking in. So during this phallic stage, children are getting sexual pleasure from playing with themselves, from masturbating with their genitals. So that's assuming all went well in the oral stage and the anal stage. Now the source of pleasure is through genital stimulation. Also during this stage, sexual desire starts to be directed toward the parent of the opposite sex. Now again, Freud did not have much to say about homosexuality, but what he did say about homosexuality was not good. So again, the phallic stage here is all of these stages really are really just referring to heterosexual children, right? So the desire is now focused or directed towards the parent of the opposite sex, And this stage can produce the Oedipal conflict in young boys, and the Electra complex in young girls, or Electra conflict in young girls. So essentially, when it comes to the Oedipal complex and boys during this phallic stage, young boys will fall in love with their moms. Young girls are gonna fall in love with their fathers. But it's more than just love, according to Freud. A young boy is going to lust for his mother. He's going to want his mother sexually. He's going to want to have sex with her. And the same for young girls. They're going to want to have sex with their father. Young boys now, they see their mother as a sexual partner, or someone they want. So the father becomes a threat to them, right? Because the father is the one who has sex with mom. Dad's the one who's in love with mom. He's the one married to mom. So dad starts becoming competition. So according to the Oedipal conflict here, the young boy wants to eliminate the threat, like literally eliminate the threat, kill dad, right? But there's a conflict there, because they still love their dad in a way, even though he's a threat. He's totally cock blocking. This kid's acts as the mom, right? So, but he still loves dad, and he also knows by now that killing is wrong. So they're kind of, struggling with this idea. But what also happens during this stage? Well, the young boys will discover that young girls don't have a penis. So what happened to their penis, right? It must have been chopped off. Somebody must have chopped it off. So if penises can get chopped off, well, then my penis can get chopped off too. So what if dad finds out that, like, I'm trying to kill him so I could be with mom? He might he might do like some preemptive shit and cut my dick off, right? Essentially what Freud claims is going through the minds, unconsciously going through the minds of these young boys. So this creates, or young boys experience, what's known as castration anxiety. And all the people with penises in my class, you can imagine if that is true. Poor us, right? Because then, according to Freud, we all went through this. Well, maybe not all of us. Maybe gay men don't go through this, according to Freud. Or, well, we won't get into Freud's homophobic theories there, but some interesting ones. So, regardless, going back to this idea, this young boy says, "Holy shit, dad might cut my dick off, so it's better for me to kind of, I can't compete with him, right? I mean, he's bigger than me, he's stronger than me, he might castrate me, but, mom likes dad, so, the dad seems to be like mom's type, so maybe if I start acting more like dad, maybe if I start kind of being more like dad, then mom will fall in love with me, right?" So the success, and this is how it successfully ends, according to Freud, is that the young boy will be terrified of being castrated by his dad. So instead of trying to kill his father, he'll instead start trying to be like his dad, start trying to emulate his dad, with the hopes that mom will, that he'll become more of mom's type, so she'll leave dad and go with him, right? Okay, pretty interesting stuff here. All semester long. I said, wait till we get to Freud. It's pretty. Come on, this is pretty good stuff. This is insanity, so to speak here. When it comes to the lecturer conflict, this is a little bit different because, according to Freud, a young girl doesn't have a penis, so she doesn't have to worry about castration anxiety. So that part is kind of out of the equation. Except according to Freud, young girls will actually blame their moms for not having a penis. Well, dad has a penis, my brothers have a penis, like the boys have a penis, so it must be your fault, mom, for why I don't have a penis. And Freud says that girls at this age will experience penis envy, that they want a penis and they're really pissed off that they don't have one. So penis envy is essentially the counterpart to castration anxiety. It's a little different because, again, the young girl doesn't have to fear her mother. She just starts to hate her mother, because mom's the reason why she doesn't have a penis. And if the young boy is fearing their father, the young girl is really just starting to resent her mother. And the difference is that young boys would have a strong motivation to kind of give up their attraction to mom, or to give up their desire to kill dad because they're afraid of castration. But young girls don't have that fear. So young girls, according to Freud, don't really have any motivation to give up their sexual attraction to their father. So it's actually kind of not clear how girls at this age would resolve this type of conflict of hating their mom and wanting to have sex with their dad. And Freud wrote that, well, some of his writings, he kind of suggests that girls don't ever really resolve this type of conflict successfully. So because there's no resolution to this conflict, their super ego doesn't really fully develop. So according to Freud, women in adulthood were actually inferior to men when it came to morality, or when it came to the superego. So plenty of sexism to go around here, but yeah, according to Freud, young girls don't really have to worry about getting their dicks cut off, so there's no reason to stop lusting after dad. So they never really do, and that's why men are morally superior than women. Hopefully you're getting an idea why we don't really subscribe to Freudian theory anymore. Okay, regardless of what happens in this phallic stage, it is incredibly traumatic, as we can imagine. So traumatic that children will basically give up on sex, like kind of goes out of their mind, don't really think about it, from age 6 to puberty. Research, of course, shows that this is not true. That we're sexual beings since, from birth until the day we die, and actually, evidence suggests we're sexual beings even inside the womb. And we see infants, or not infants, fetuses, actually what appears to be masturbating inside a womb, inside before they're even born. We're rubbing ones out, right? So even during the latency stage, there's still some sexual desire going on. This is what research, modern contemporary research has shown. But according to Freud, this stage is pretty devoid of any type of sexual development, and thus not a whole lot of psychological development is happening at this point either. So because of the lack of any specific sexual conflict at this time, Freud believed that it kind of represented a pause in psychological development or personality development. Nothing's really happening. Child is just focusing on learning skills and abilities that they'll need in order to be successful as an adult. Contemporary psychoanalysis again have argued that a bunch of development is happening during this stage, including psychological and sexual development, and children are learning how to navigate build and navigate relationships during this time. They're also learning kind of who they are, developing a sense of identity or a sense of self, and they're also starting to kind of find meaning in the work that they're doing, and in the hobbies that they participate in. So there's a whole bunch of stuff happening during this latency phase, but not according to Freud. According to Freud, nothing's really happening until puberty, where we will enter into the genital stage. So once we reach the genital stage, the libido is focused on the genitals, but not necessarily in the manner of self-manipulation. So not necessarily in the manner of masturbation that we saw in the phallic stage. Instead, the focus here is on finding a sexual partner, finding a mate. So the focus is of sexual gratifications on the genitals, as being manipulated by someone other than you, essentially. Again, this is the final stage, so there's no conflict necessarily to overcome. What it basically represents is the culmination of those earlier stages, particularly the first 3 stages. And if you do well with those first 3 stages, you should do pretty good when it comes to finding meaningful and fulfilling sexual relationships during this genital stage. So again, people will reach this stage only if the conflicts at the previous stages are resolved. Now, when we say people will reach this stage, say successfully reach this stage, meaning that they'll have happy, healthy, well-adjusted sexual and romantic relationships, only if the conflicts in those other stages were successfully resolved. If they weren't successfully resolved, people are still going to be having sex and still going to be in romantic and sexual relationships, but they're likely to have a lot of problems in those types of relationships. Okay, so when it comes to personality and psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis is a method of psychotherapy, and the purpose behind psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, because according to psychoanalytic theory, the only way that you can fully resolve an issue, or a mental health issue or a personality issue, is by getting to the root cause of it. So psychoanalysis as a therapy technique can be viewed as a method of deliberately restructuring somebody's personality, bringing all that unconscious stuff to the surface and dealing with it, right? So making the unconscious conscious. As I said, psychoanalysis can be thought of as a method for deliberately restructuring personality. The connection between, say, psychoanalytic theory of personality and the techniques used in psychoanalysis are really strong, very, very much tied together. So the first aim of psychoanalysis is to identify unconscious thoughts and feelings. So once a patient is aware of these unconscious thoughts and feelings, the second aim is to then enable the person to deal with these things in a realistic and mature, quote unquote, mature type of way. So bringing that unconscious material to the surface and then dealing with it. So some of the techniques that are used for revealing the unconscious, the first is free association. So if the aim is to identify unconscious thoughts, one way of doing this is to get people to just discuss or mention, talk about anything that comes to their mind, or the first things that come to their mind. So during free association, you basically instruct the patient to let their mind wander and say whatever that comes to them. The key here is that for free association to work according to psychoanalysis is that patients can't censor themselves. They have to just come out with whatever it is, no matter how taboo it is, no matter how morally corrupt it is, whatever the case may be. It just has to be a free flowing stream of thoughts. And this can, among this free flowing stream of thoughts, are going to be some unconscious things that the psychoanalysis, the therapist is going to be able to try to pick up on and help the patient identify. Another method for revealing the unconscious is through dream analysis. And when we talk about dreams, there's basically two types of context associated with dreams. The first is the manifest context. So this is what a dream actually contains. So what happened in the dream, and then also late content, which is what the elements of the dream actually represent. And you find a whole bunch of information about dream analysis and when this happens in the dream, it means that, and when this happens, it means that. There's really there's no scientific evidence, no validity to any of that stuff. Well, what I will say though is that if you do have a recurring dream, constant recurring dream about a particular thing, it's likely something that you should probably talk to somebody about. But this whole idea of, flying in a dream means this, or someone chasing you in a dream means that. Maybe, I don't know, or maybe like you watch a horror movie before going to bed, or maybe you ate a chalupa or something from Taco Bell that's not sitting right with you. Nobody really knows how dreams work. Current understanding is that dreams, our brains are active while we sleep. I mean, our brains use sleep, particularly REM sleep, to consolidate memories, to take memories and store them into long-term memories. So the brain is firing off all over the place. And then there's other parts of our brain saying, what the fuck's going on? I thought we were sleeping. Well, where's all this activity coming from? So essentially your prefrontal cortex, this part of your brain up here, that's responsible for planning and organization and imagination, is saying, well, let's take all these signals going on and try to make sense of it. So it creates a story, essentially. But the way that, or the story it creates, one could argue might, especially if it's constantly creating the same story over and over, that might be significant in some way, right? That's not necessarily how Freud approached dream analysis, or how many psychoanalysts have approached dream analysis, but dreams might be able to tell us something about about what you might need to work on, a problem that continues to bother you. Another method for tapping into the unconscious is these projective techniques. Talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the different types of data that are available to us when studying personality. And projective techniques are, things like that, those ink block tests where you're given these really ambiguous images and you're asked to, tell me, what do you see? What do you see in this image? And, somebody's there to kind of interpret what you see. If you see a bunch of aggressive stuff or happy stuff or disturbing stuff, I don't know. There's little to no reliability or validity when it comes to those projective tests, but they were used for a very long time, and then they're still used sometimes. So the process of psychoanalysis, the psychoanalyst is going to offer interpretations of psychodynamic causes of problems. So essentially, what the therapist or the psychoanalysis, what their role is to try to help you tap into those unconscious beliefs, unconscious thoughts, unconscious memories and desires and urges, and they're not typically, they don't just come out. They're gonna come out in dreams, or come out in symbols, or come out in different symbolic ways. And part of the role of the therapist in psychoanalysis is to offer up these interpretations of what these things might mean, right? So through these interpretations, say many types of interpretations, the patient will hopefully gain quote unquote insight. And an insight refers to an understanding of the unconscious sources of the problem. So you're going to, through free association, through dream analysis, through these projective tests, try to conjure up, bring up memories, feelings, desires, urges from the unconscious. They might represent themselves in different types of ways, where the psychoanalyst is going to offer interpretations of those things, and hopefully through those interpretations you will have a few aha type of moments. Okay, well that makes sense because blah blah blah, right? And it's through experiencing those unconscious things consciously that you heal from them. So psychoanalysis is usually a very long process, years, decades, maybe the rest of your life you could be in psychoanalysis, either the rest of your life or your therapist's life, but it's usually a very long type of process compared to some of the cognitive behavioral therapy models that exist now. So some other processes here. We could see that clearly that process of insight, putting things together, actually understanding the interpretations that the psychoanalyst is providing to you, and then piecing them together and having some type of insightful aha type of moment can be really difficult. That shit is in the unconscious for a reason. It's painful stuff. It's stuff that we don't want to be thinking about. So a few, say, roadblocks or challenges will often arise during the psychoanalytic process, during the course of therapy. The first is patient resistance, and this is just when the patient will actively work against the psychoanalyst. They're very threatened by the type of probing questions that the therapist might be asking. They'll refuse to answer, or they'll answer untruthfully, or they will try to say redirect the question, or redirect the conversation by avoiding a question or changing the topic, things like that. So it's basically actively trying to compromise the work that's trying to be done. Another is patient transference, and I'm sure that's a word that you've heard before. But in this stage, during transference, the patient starts to essentially react to the analyst, react to the therapist, in a way that they would react to, say, an important person in their life. So transference could, say, be good or bad. It's always something that needs to be overcome, and it's almost always something that's going to happen. So you might start seeing qualities of, say, your mom or your dad or your husband or wife or lover or sibling or whoever. You might start seeing qualities of one of those people in your therapist, and then you start acting that way towards your therapist. So, this is why some people, it's not uncommon for people to fall in love with their therapist. Then, therapists are trained how to deal with that, because this is transference. So the idea behind transference is that the interpersonal problems that a patient might have with other say, important people in their life is basically being reenacted in therapy between the therapist and this patient. So hopefully the end of transference, how it will be resolved, is that the patient is going to learn how to actually deal with the real person that they were, transferring all that stuff onto the therapist from. But that's definitely part of the process. And part of this also deals with the idea of repetition compulsion. So this is where the person reenacts their interpersonal problems with new people, including the psychoanalyst. So it's related to transference, but transference is more about seeing particular qualities of an individual in the therapist, where this idea of repetition compulsion is that, if you just have a tendency to sabotage relationships, you're going to repeat or try to repeat that same tendency within the therapy session as well. So why is psychoanalysis important? It's an old theory, right? Most of the stuff we can't test. Some of it's really kind of sexist and outdated, but it continues to have an influence on modern psychotherapy. Its continuing influence on research topics, including the unconscious and defense mechanisms, instead of viewing them from a psychoanalyst, say, perspective, or psychoanalysis perspective. We tend to view the unconscious more from a cognitive perspective. We kind of refer to unconscious processes as implicit processes. And defense mechanisms are most certainly a thing. We study them from a cognitive perspective, from a social perspective, and from a clinical perspective. Psychoanalysis continues to be very influential on pop culture. Take a look at any movie or TV show that involves a therapy session or a relationship between someone and a therapist. I'm gonna bet you it's a psychoanalyst or somebody practicing psychoanalysis. And very few people do that nowadays. Also, psychoanalysis laid the foundation for topics and questions that psychologists are still interested in today. I mean, for all of Freud's issues, he was revolutionary for his time. Believe it or not, I mean, it's unfortunate, but Freud, the outcome is unfortunate. But again, during the Victorian era, so people still believe that hysteria in women was due to a wandering womb, that the woman's uterus was floating around the body and it was confused and causing anxiety. I'm not shitting you here, right? So, Freud was the first person to realize, to uncover that a lot of the patients that he was seeing, that their symptoms of, say, quote unquote hysteria, were actually due to PTSD from childhood sexual abuse. And remember, this is Sigmund Freud, famous psychologist here, his patients weren't just anybody, right? His patients were the sons and daughters of very powerful and rich people. So Freud caused quite a bit of stir, quite a bit of controversy by suggesting that these powerful and rich people were molesting their children. But he nailed it. Unfortunately, he caved to pressure and backtracked. But he was the first to discover that, and even though he backtracked, it certainly paved the way for other people to investigate that. People who had, say, quote unquote, less to lose than Freud. Evaluating Freud's contributions, psychoanalysis clearly has had a major impact on psychology, psychiatry, and even just Western thought. It's embedded in our culture. Again, even the words that we use, to describe people, kind of stem from psychoanalysis. A lot of the things that we're still interested in, dream analysis is still a pretty big thing, right? Some criticisms we've already talked about, a few of these, but just to summarize them, Freud's theory is largely historical in nature. It doesn't directly inform much of the research or much of the theory in personality psychology nowadays. So again, it was kind of the beginning of all of this. Still influential, but not really directly anymore. Also, Freud did not believe in the value of experimentation or hypothesis testing. So there's no way to test any of his theories, no matter how cool they are, right? I mean, come on, a kid wants to kill his dad and fuck his mom, but he decides not to because he's afraid dad's gonna cut his dick off. That came from the father of psychology, right? That you can't make this stuff up, right? Okay, how do we go about testing this? How do we operate? Well, you can't, because it's all unconscious, so the kid's not gonna know he wants to do. Okay, so I guess that's that. Well, I guess we have to take Freud's word for it, right? Also, Freud relied on case studies of a selected group of very wealthy and powerful women. Most of his clients were daughters, daughters and wives of very powerful and rich men at the time, in order to generate his theory. So not exactly a representative or large sample. And also, some personality psychologists will take issue with Freud's general overall negative view of human nature. We could also throw in a bullet point there that his theories were pretty homophobic and sexist, and in some cases racist. But again, product of his times, or a product of his time. To his credit, Freud was the first to at least say that people didn't choose to be gay or lesbian or bi. The concept of transgenderism didn't exist at this time. Transgender people definitely existed, but the concept of it was not studied or examined. So, in summary, Freud's theory of human nature emphasizes how the psyche is compartmentalized into conscious and unconscious portions, and I'll say, and how those portions interact with each other. or don't interact with each other and cause some problems. Also, psychoanalysis aims to make a person's unconscious conscious, in order for the person to be able to deal with those unconscious issues and feel the emotions that are associated with those unconscious feelings and thoughts. And the value of psychoanalysis is debated, but there's pretty much no denying that it has had a ton of influence on our discipline and, say, Western society as a whole. Okay, that's the end of this chapter 9 lecture. I'm gonna go take a break, and then we'll do chapter 10, which is basically part 2 of Freud. Okay, so see you all in a bit.